Okay, good morning, folks, and welcome to the final stretch of the Northern Narratives Conference. Thank you all for your attendance over the last couple of days, and a really quite astounding array of papers and interesting research questions and methodologies and sources. And today we're going to try our very best to bring some of these themes together in a more wider discussion about the future of early modern studies, where we see our field going, and potentially how it can impact both our research but also our teaching. And what I'm going to do just now is I'm going to invite some of our keynote speakers from over the last couple of days to join us in a roundtable, which will be led by Professor David Burlington. A very warm welcome to David.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everybody for coming along. We've got about an hour, so yeah, I'm Professor David Worthington, so my substantive role is at the Centre for History, but currently I'm the Interim Dean of the Arts, Humanities, Business and Education faculty here at UHI. So I'm really sorry I wasn't able to take part in large chunks of the conference, but it's an absolute pleasure and a delight to chair this roundtable. Given we only have an hour, I think what I'll do is just introduce our four members of the roundtable, besides myself. Unfortunately, we had hoped that Professor Steve Murdoch and Professor Mark Elliott would be able to contribute, but they can't for different reasons. So that's unfortunate, but I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our four speakers who you'll all have heard of during the conference to this point. First is Professor Mark Gardner, who's an archaeologist, as I think we all know, at the University of Lincoln. We have Dr. Simon Burton, who is a theologian at the University of Edinburgh. And we have two UHI colleagues, Dr. Lucy Dean, who's the interim head of the Centre for History, and Dr. Katrin Zickerman, also of the Centre for History at UHI. So I think in the spirit of the conference, this is a round table. I want to hear the thoughts from the speakers, but do please raise your hand or put something in the chat if you have a question or a comment for our speakers. I've got various items I want to speak about, but I won't delay things too long on that. So do have a think about themes that come up while the speakers are talking. So I'm going to start by asking all of you the following question. And it's just a brief one, really. You've been participating in this conference. It's now drawing to a close. Do you have one particular highlight from what you've heard or what you've picked up from the proceedings of the conference? So it's an open, maybe I'll actually direct that at one of you first and we'll move from there. So I'll ask Simon first, because Simon has the most exotic background that I can see. So I'm going to go to Simon.
Yeah, thanks. Well, my first article was on English royalism, and I've worked on some Scottish royalists who are theologians. So I really enjoyed that, and I love heraldry. But I think Andrew actually raised a kind of thing that stood out for me, which was the northern networks in all kinds of areas. Lots of the papers had intriguing kind of intersections with things that I do, and some of these connections between the Netherlands and Scotland and Sweden. Yeah, you could trace them in the 15th century, but also in the 17th century with a kind of circle of reformers and further reformers that I work with, and interacting with some of those military figures as well. So I found that really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like the North Sea was crucial. In the title of the conference, we had the North Atlantic, and the Baltic, and the North Sea as an intermediate space within that is clearly of vital importance. So thank you, Simon. Really appreciate that. And I'll ask Katrin next.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to find one highlight of the conference because there were so many, and I was just blown away by the diversity of the papers, and it's been just really fantastic. I think the papers which I enjoyed most were the ones which were dealing with different types of sources, which I had not really considered for my own research. So I think all the sources or the material sources which relate to warfare were in particular of interest to me. So I'm thinking about the flags, for example, in Karin Teteres's paper, which are amazing. And my personal highlight was also the tool which was used for the musket balls. I think it was Derek's paper. I think that was just fantastic to see that. So something I don't really consider so much as a historian working with written sources. So that was just really amazing and a highlight for me.
Yeah, there's a crossover with what Simon said there in terms of material culture and objects and things being of relevance here. So I'm going to pass on to Mark, please.
Well, rather strangely, and we hadn't organised this, I actually very much, my independent thoughts were very much along the lines that Katrin has already mentioned. It was about the materiality of objects, but it was the materiality of objects related to their historical context. And this is, one of the really exciting things about this period. And as an archaeologist, I often think, historians think and indeed archaeologists think there's no need for archaeology now because we've got all the written records. No. It's the objects with the written records which really illuminate one another. So again, it was Derek Alexander's paper on the Battle of Ghent Shield, which I found very interesting. But rather like Katrin, I was very excited, and this was a real surprise to me, by Karen Tetras's paper on flags. I'll tell you why I was so excited about it, because flags to me, you see them occasionally in churches or you see them in military museums and you think, oh my God, how boring are these? And suddenly these were not boring. These became really, really interesting, meaningful objects. And I think this is the real interest, that when you put these objects in context and understand what they mean, then suddenly their whole meaning, their significance becomes alive. And it's this combination of meaning and object, which is so exciting. So that was very interesting. I realise I was asked for one highlight, but I have to link it back to Anna Groundwater's discussion of objects, because again, it was this combination of putting the objects, she was struggling to do, but working very hard, but I thought very successfully, putting the objects in context. And suddenly these objects, instead of being things in a museum cabinet, suddenly became live and vital and significant and so on. So this, the conference was conceived of as an interdisciplinary enterprise. And I think that those points where the disciplines really crossed over, I thought were the most exciting for me.
That's fascinating. Yeah, real synergy with what's been said already. And I'm wondering about different approaches to those objects from the different disciplines. Material culture and objects is the meeting space, but different routes into that and different routes out of that, depending on our disciplinary backgrounds. Fascinating. Thanks. So over to you, Lucy.
Yeah, so I suppose unsurprisingly, material culture was something of a highlight for me as well, and it's the way that it spread across many things. But actually, that's not the point I was going to raise as my highlight, because I also struggled with finding one highlight of the conference. But I think for me, the highlight links to a point that Brian Williams made about the importance of REMRA and conferences like this in his open remarks in terms of social capital and networking, as it's been so lovely to see the amount of connections being made between people in the conference in terms of potential synergies between things that people have been working on, sharing references and ideas, and emerging connections generated through the responses in the Q&A sessions. So for me, this emphasises the essential nature of such conferences and extends the aims of REMRA, and is something that UHI should be actively supporting in any way that it can. And I also thought that seeing the vibrancy and variety of people's work under the title of Northern Narratives, even though I was sadly unable to make all of the panels on Wednesday, even with the panels that I have seen, the variety and richness of the research being done around the colleagues who've presented in the conference, it's just so exciting. And I think when we're thinking about the future of early modern studies, this is a hugely positive thing.
Yeah, well said. And positioning that and placing that and feeding into, I know you were talking about public history and public engagement amongst early modernists. Sometimes we don't get the showcasing, for want of a better term, than maybe we deserve. And we have work to do in that regard. We have work to do to encourage others to support us in that regard. Yeah, this is a really terrific discussion already. I think I find myself, when I got into early modern history, I'll be quite blunt, I don't think I really appreciated the importance of visual art to any great extent. And I know the Low Countries golden age is absolutely to the fore in my thinking, and I love well, for one, I love going to galleries now, and I think I appreciate that work 100 times more than I used to. But my route in was through my research, and I found that really hugely important. So I think the visual arts, music, there are all sorts of other things we could talk about there, where we can also meet, I think, and bridge some of the disciplinary gaps if they exist, chasms. They probably don't. I think a conference like this indicates that they don't, but there's still more work we could do to bring people together. So that leads me quite nicely, I think, to my second question area, which is around this multidisciplinary space or transdisciplinary space, interdisciplinary space. We could get pedantic and think about the differences, important differences between those terms. What I can see looking at this, and again, apologies for not attending the whole conference, we've had archaeologists, we've had theologians, we have museum curators like Anna, and historians. And I wondered, a question for all of you, based on what you've said already, which disciplines, which areas of expertise, inevitably, the conference didn't cover everything, which areas where you think, oh gosh, I wish we'd had this kind of person to speak to this? And was there a gap? Was there an area that you felt perhaps in the theme of objects and things, or maybe something else, but which disciplinary area do you feel could have been usefully added here and which you didn't hear from or we didn't hear about? If that makes sense. That's not a very concise way of putting it, but I'm going to ask Simon first.
I think from the perspective of the kind of thing Mark and I do, historians of philosophy are really some of our big dialogue partners, and we've both been privileged to have a lot to do with Alexander Brodie and his work, as not just for philosophy or theology, but for all kinds of things, as thrown open windows. But actually, I'd also say art history and book history. It's been lovely to have Anna here, and Anna and I have had the chance to speak before, but also book history. There's so many interesting things happening with kind of illuminated manuscripts and annotations, and also Scottish incunabula and things, and that reflects on universities, but it reflects on a lot of other things like patronage and all kinds of things. So I think book history could be really interesting.
Yeah, and the migration of those objects, I suppose, the movement of those between different collectors, there's a certain shared practice in terms of art collections and book collections. Fascinating, thanks. Katrin.
Yeah, I would second that history of books and more people maybe also presenting on literature. We had a few papers touching on that, like the epic, for example, and the poems coming up. I thought these were amazing sources. So, and I don't think about these enough in my research. So that was really interesting. I was also thinking about archivists and librarians, bringing those people more into the boat as well. So Ivo was there from Greifswald as a librarian, but maybe more people working in these type of facilities, like special collections. As REMRA, we have already reached out to Perth archives, for example, but maybe doing that a bit more, bringing in more people to tell us more about the materiality of their collections. I think that would be amazing to hear more of, I think.
Yeah, and that's something you've done a lot in the last few years in terms of your Southern Baltic work, Katrin. Very aware of that, and elsewhere, but I'm particularly aware of that, some of the work you've done in Greifswald and other cities. Terrific. Okay, excellent. Mark, any gaps, any things you would love to hear, would love to have heard a bit more of, but we couldn't fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in space and the way, you know, people exist in the landscape, in space, and that includes at sea as well. So although I touched upon charts, I mean, someone talking about charts and maps, inland maps, you know, there was a bit of discussion, I think, about Ponce map. I think was that you, Lucy, who brought Ponce map in? I think, but I think, you know, this is all part of this sort of the way we understand this expanding world, the knowledge of the North, and connected with that is, I think it would be very interesting to have had somebody talking about place names. Place names, you know, they are a way in which we enculturate the landscape, the world. And the way we use them, the way they are created, I think is a very, very interesting subject. And there is this sense of a very long oral history, oral memory, which goes back I'm going to use the word traditional societies, but it's a very poorly defined terms, but societies in which book learning and written documents are perhaps less important than oral culture. So I think that has got a lot to give. But I think generally, I mean, it's the real challenge, I think, is bringing all this material together rather than piling in more disciplines.
Yeah, and maybe it's a question of orienting around particular source types and looking at the ways that different scholars from different disciplines can add to that. Might be a useful approach. Lucy.
Yeah, I had quite a few of the same sort of things in mind. I had sort of thinking about art and architectural historians, perhaps, and literary scholars. It would have been, like Katrin said, there was things touching on the wonders that we can find in those sorts of sources, but bringing a bit more of that in would have been wonderful. However, I was also thinking about things like creative practice, such as explored by Raggy in her contribution yesterday, is something that also could feature much more widely in terms of the ways that we communicate about what we're doing, as well as how we research what we're doing. And I also thought that, for obvious reasons, REMRA is very humanities focused, for very good reasons. But it could also be good to see occasionally spreading our interdisciplinarity, stretching it a bit further, connections to other disciplines beyond ours, such as health and science and things like that. So obviously there's connections already visible in areas, particularly archaeology, but this could be perhaps something that we aspired to in the future in terms of how the amazing work that we're doing on the early modern period might feed into those sorts of other subjects through interdisciplinary conversations.
Yeah, I think there, on occasions, it could probably be a light bulb moment in terms of you might not think your research has relevance for environmental humanities or for health humanities, but in fact it does. And that is something I think that might come up a lot. So thanks to all of you for that. I was wondering about another theme, perhaps, which comes back to, I know Lucy was speaking about public history, but there are challenges for us in the early modern. If we speak to the public, many people are interested in the medieval and they're interested in the modern. We have some bigger challenges in terms of representation of the early modern or memory of the early modern. And I wondered if that was something that came up. I'm thinking of Judith Pullman's book on memory in early modern Europe, but we seem to have something of a challenge there in public perceptions of the period. They're a bit unsure about the dates we're dealing with. Wondered if any of you wanted to comment on that. How do we get school kids interested in the early modern? What's our route into that? How do we engage with the public on that, when the term itself for us is very useful, but it can also be a bit of a barrier to some people because they don't know quite what it is. Wonder if any of you had any thoughts on that kind of narrative and dialogue around the early modern. Katrin.
I think it depends on where you are. I think, what you've just said, it comes very much from the British, Scottish perspective, perhaps. But when you're going to Germany, for example, the 30 Years' War is still quite prominent. So people know about this conflict, and because it had such a profound impact. There's little sayings in German, which relate to the war and all of that. So I think the challenges are different in different places. I think that's the first thing I want to say about that. And then, I mean, how to make it more visible, I guess, is the question, right? And I think it is visible even in Scotland because it's attached to particular topics, like, for example, Mary Queen of Scots, like at the earliest maybe time period of the early modern, because that features already in schools. So people are, I think, engaging with it, but not necessarily associating with that this is early modern. But I think it's not that it's completely absent, if that makes sense. People are just maybe not realizing, that they have now left the medieval and moving into something else. I guess we can do more. Absolutely, it's not like that. There's not any work left to do. So maybe more engagement and making it more visible, and that's maybe where we again need these different types of sources, which really capture imagination. So like archaeological sources, for example, or other material sources that we can use for exhibitions, or just bringing it a bit closer to people.
Absolutely. I think what we've been discussing in the first part, or what you've been raising in the first part of the round table, to me gives me a lot of heart in that, because I think it's hugely accessible. It gives people really great routes into the period to do that. And your point, Catherine, not just Mary Queen of Scots, is quite an interesting way to start it. And I absolutely take on board your point about different national, international context for this, linguistic context for this, where early modern is recognised in many parts of the world as significant, certainly within Europe. I'm just noting points in the chat. I'm keen that we deal with those in case they accumulate, because we're recording this and people won't be seeing the chat. But there's a point made by Karin around architectural historian Giovanna Giudicini and her book on triumphal entries and festivals in early modern Scotland. Yeah, that looks like a really important contribution to the previous discussion point. And interdisciplinary work and challenges. Yeah, I'm going to come to challenges. We've been very positive about that. But anyway, before we get to that, I need to ask Simon and Lucy Lucy and Mark. So Mark, you've got your hand up, so I'll let you go first in terms of the question.
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, interdisciplinary challenges, but I was totally, I mean, Lucy might want to comment on this, but I was totally amazed and delighted, as clearly she was, about when she said she was doing this work in Perth, and the areas that the community she was working with said that they were interested was not the most recent, but in fact the medieval and early modern documents. Wow, who would have guessed, stuff which is apparently so difficult to approach. That was what they really wanted to engage with. And I mean, I think, as teachers, we often think, we've got to give stuff to students that that can capture their imaginations. But sometimes I think that we don't appreciate that students like the challenge. And in your case, Lucy, the community liked the challenge, that challenge of working out this material, which clearly captured their imagination. So I think there are some really interesting issues there about working out about how to convey material and how to get this material through to a wider audience that people are interested in. I think the other thing is that they're also interested in how we do the job, how we do the work. Now, in archaeology, it's much easier to do it because it's a sort of active process, but in the archives, well, I sit there and I read the documents, I know Latin, and I can do this and I can do that. It's much more a sort of cerebral and less physical and visible activity. But I think that having discussions, and often I think seeing people disagree or seeing people work out the problems is a very, very good way, people certainly to involve students, but also to involve the broader public, to show how we do this sort of work, how the work in action, the process of thinking in action. And so I think it's a sort of way of bringing in people and bringing in subjects together.
Yeah, so the act of doing that history is in itself a way of reaching out to the public. Yeah, that's a really powerful point. Lucy.
I'd just echo what Mark was saying, really, in terms of the fact that I think there's more of a thirst for this era out there than we imagine, but I think that the way that we can best engage people is by doing the history with them, by finding ways of supporting them in understanding the types of materials that we use, in the practices of debating around a topic and figuring things out, and the firmer understanding that there isn't one answer to this question. We can't tell you this for definite, but we can have a debate about the different sides of this argument. I thought it was quite interesting that somebody had put in the chat about the English curriculum spending more time on the early modern period, but very rarely calling it early modern, so they tend to use Tudors and Stuarts as the sort of catchphrase for it, which is very anglicised because it doesn't have any relevance really anywhere else other than England really, and some of the other British Isles. But I think that that thinking about how we communicate the era that we're talking about, it could be beyond Mary, it could be beyond the Reformation. You can identify the things that people know about and ask them to think beyond it. And I think that's a really interesting way as well, Katrin, of getting people to think and engage about the time period that we're talking about, who may not necessarily understand our periodizations, but ultimately across disciplines we could have debates about those periodizations as well, because we might all define them slightly differently.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I was just thinking, you know, if we look at this Highlands and Islands of Scotland, in my view, you have a real kind of, it's hard to get a sense of the nature or big features of a period between 1493 and 1746. So the annexation of the Lordship of the Isles, very impressive medieval polity, and Culloden. And if you ask people to think about that period in between, they might be aware of a few events, but it's very hard to get a sense of the overarching features. And yet it's 2.5 centuries, vital centuries. And I don't know how that maybe applies to some other parts of these islands and also other parts of Europe. But I think it brings us back to the point that Katrin made, that there are regional contexts to this, and it's different in different parts of our place that we are looking at, whatever that may be. So I'm going to move on here, and I'm absolutely convinced by this. I think we all have a sense of the positive nature and the huge advantages of this multidisciplinary context. But I do want to just dig a bit deeper and ask you about, what challenges do you think there are in being multidisciplinary as regards the early modern period? Where could we do it better, and what are some of the challenges that we haven't raised already? So that's to you, Simon.
Yeah, I think one challenge following up from what we're just talking about is just thinking about the fact that different disciplines actually have different periodizations. Obviously, for theology, the Reformation looms very large. So when people talk about early modern theology, they tend to mean 16th and 17th century. But I know art historians sometimes use early modern for 15th century. And then also there's a tendency for medieval and Renaissance historians to do, of whichever area, to do entirely different things, while forgetting that the two areas actually intermingled, and it's sometimes a shock to me to think this was, and then suddenly that actually all these developments of medieval thought or theology were going on at the same time. And then I think the other thing is also that bridging that gap between social, material, and intellectual history, I think often we're a bit nervous of speaking to each other, or think that we don't have so much to say to each other. But then lots of things at this conference have shown that's not true. Like talk about Livingston and then the Perth Charterhouse coming up, and you know, Carthusians and Carthusian networks, or naval history wouldn't seem to have much to do with the kind of thing that Mark and I do, but Hugo Grotius is a big figure in 17th century theology came up, and then also maritime insurance, and John Mayer was a pioneer in the ethics of kind of insurance, and even and including maritime insurance. So actually there are quite a lot of connections. It just, if we start talking to each other and hearing from each other in our own terms, and then sort of trying to dialogue as well across the boundaries.
Yeah, I hear your points. I think not letting that slight changes or differing definitions of chronology shouldn't really hold us back, but they can a bit, and also opening up these conversations in the way that this conference, I think, has. So yeah, really good points. Katrin, what do you envisage as some of the challenges, maybe from your own work or just in general?
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit more practical here. You know, it's the funding. You know, like, you know, obviously events like this I've brought out, what you just said, Simon. There's so many connections which we were not necessarily aware of, and this reluctance, perhaps, to speak to each other. We need these events to come together and talk to each other, because realistically, at our institutions, if you're employed at a university, you will be in a history department and in an archaeology department and so on. So in our everyday work, there is maybe not so much opportunity, or not always the opportunity, to speak to colleagues elsewhere. And that's where REMRA, I think, has been such a good thing for UHI, because we have really started to talk to each other across these different centres. And I think that's been very successful. But it also involves time, and time is money. So yeah, just funding and maybe just greater awareness of bringing in people from different disciplines into events like this is really, it's a challenge, but once it's been done, it's also proves very, very fruitful for future collaborations, I hope.
Maybe some of that is about the narrative, because I think in some ways it opens you up to funding possibilities, taking that approach. Across humanities approach, or bringing in social sciences, or thinking of Lucy's point, there are all sorts of ways other disciplines could come in to this too, and it could be seen as addressing very current problems, sustainable development, health issues in the contemporary world, which are the kind of things that, the kind of language we have to speak in order to obtain funding, I guess. So I'm just, again, keeping an eye on the chat. I don't want to lose sight of the points that are being made. So Sarah Jane makes a point related to what was being said about drop-in days, and that engaging with the public is in itself a really useful way of spreading the word about the early modern. The integrative humanities. Oh, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. So I'll maybe get our panel to reflect on that. But over to you, Mark, please, on the challenges. Oh no, you've already commented on this in some way, but not. Maybe it was. Yeah, over to you, please.
Perhaps that's right. You can just sort of add a little bit more, because I think one of the challenges is to actually get people to climb out of their particular specialities. I mean, we all have specialities. We're all very good in our area. We know our area, but that's not the point. The point is, you can't stick people together in a room and all they do is talk about their tiny specialities. The challenge, it seems to me, is for us to actually think, what does this mean in a wider sense? Because if we can think of what it means in a wider sense, then that's where we can all join together. If I'm going to talk about the details of archaeology, the details of buildings, other people, eyes will glaze over. Yeah, okay, well, that's fine, but it means nothing to me. If I can start talking about what its wider significance is, then they can start saying, yeah, but I don't find that, or I do find that. And then we can begin to actually move ahead in a sort of more synthetic way.
Synthetic approaches, excellent points. Thank you, Mark. Lucy.
Yeah, I suppose I would just echoing some of the things that other people have said, but I think that for me, ultimately, particularly looking at Northern European regions, that in the early modern and late medieval period, I think the level of interdisciplinarity is a necessity to really get under the skin of the era. Certainly as a historian of late medieval and early modern Scotland, being willing to cast your net a bit wider and embrace different sources and methodologies tends to be really enriching, and in some cases, definitely in my own work on ritual and ceremony, entirely necessary to do. But I think that there are obviously challenges with that. It's either means being incredibly adaptable and responsive to exploring new approaches, theories and methods, and trying to wrap your head around things like that you perhaps didn't expect you're going to have to wrap your head around, but also finding the right people to work with and not reinventing the wheel. I'm not an archaeologist or a theologian, and there are plenty of people who already have these skills who you can work with. So I think, like Katrin, forums like this are essential to better recognise who might be out there with similar interests or valuable experiences, who could benefit from something you could offer them in return. And also thinking about the point Katrin made about time, I also think it's really important to think about the different commitments and pressures of people that you might want to work with. So there can be all the enthusiasm in the world, and I think forums like this are generally very enthusiastic, and we want to carry on the conversations, but ultimately we have to recognise that there are challenges and efforts are required around working in those collaborative interdisciplinary ways that mean that we really have to be very respectful of each other's time constraints and different timetables and pressures that we might face depending on whether we're academics or working in curating or museums or even just within academia in different disciplines and different countries.
Yeah, well said. And we'll maybe come back to those points. I won't leave you till last in asking the questions from now on, Lucy, because that's probably been a challenge in itself. But thanks for that. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I was thinking of one element that maybe is just coming up in the chat, which is around environmental history, thinking of the Little Ice Age, climate change, and being such an important feature of this period, and also one where, presented correctly, there are funding possibilities. Does anybody have any comments on the potential of environmental history for the early modern? That's an open question. Just noticing, I'll just build on the comment then of Julia in the chat. I would like to see landscape in a broad sense, sea waterscapes included in combining objects and histories and biographies. So I guess there's hugely changed waterscape and thinking of the engineering that took place around these locations. Again, climate as a factor there. Is there more that we could be doing in that space? Just thinking there's been so much terrific work done on that in the last 30, 40 years, but is there more space for that, or is that being done? Mark?
Yeah, I mean, environmental history often seems to me to have, it's been approached from a scientific point of view. So we've got, a large number of scientific studies, which are absolutely useful. The environmental humanities have, I think, particularly in recent years, have sort of veered towards extremities. They've sort of been looking at dramatic events. Catastrophe is a big theme at the moment in some of the areas I'm dealing with. And it seems to me that we're keen about these things, partly because they're so important, they're so big, and therefore, we can make a grab at people's attention. But I think we need to sort of think more generally about how climate change does affect people's day-to-day existence. I'm thinking houses, if it's raining more, what's the effect on houses, on roofing, on crops, on when you can get out? And we have to sort of drill down, not in a sort of over dramatic way or a over imaginative way, but actually try and think these things through. So I think there is a real scope for getting beyond, if you like, the catastrophic towards the mundane, and how climate change really did affect people's existence, people's being. And it was touched upon in Jen Harlan's paper, who mentioned how her work on fishing is feeding into Paul Holmes's bigger project on fish stocks and so on. So I think there are ways in there, there are connections that we can make, but I don't know that we've actually sort of really thought through the themes yet.
That's fascinating. Yeah, a move from the catastrophic to the mundane. So Lucy?
I'd sort of echo the same points as well. I mean, it's not something that I've directly interacted with personally in my own research, except for in that capacity, in terms of how the fact that it was potentially pouring with rain in the middle of November when a coronation was supposed to be happening outside might have affected how that coronation might have taken place. But I think that's perhaps an area that we don't look at as much, and we tend to gravitate towards crisis when we think about environmental history. At least I do, and so I perhaps don't think about the ways that it could best integrate with the kind of research that I do. But also I think that I'd also point people to the 3-volume work that's just come out by Professor Oram, which is definitely trying to look at the longue durée of change and also provide a platform for us to do that sort of work and think about how we can incorporate it into our own work if we're working on Scotland particularly.
Yeah, really good point. That Scottish context is really useful. I'm going to just keep your eyes on the chat, folks. while you're not speaking, but listen as well. So I'm going to pass on to Simon now.
Yeah, we've just had Alexandra Walsham doing Gifford lectures in Edinburgh, and she's written an amazing book called The Reformation of the Landscape, where she looks at Britain and Ireland and the different shifting attitudes to the landscape. And it's not a very obvious narrative because you expect it to be a kind of disenchantment narrative of dissolution of the monasteries and destruction of shrines, and it definitely is that, but it's also actually partly a kind of re-enchantment narrative, as other people were inspired to do kind of the contemplation of God through creation, or the intersection of science and theology, and all kinds of issues about the natural and supernatural and landscape. So it's actually, before that, I don't think it was a big area in Reformational theology, but she's really brought it to attention and then linked it to these big kind of narratives of modernity. So I think that's a really interesting thing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Simon. And over to you, Catherine.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Mark has said, and Lucy as well to a certain extent. But I was also thinking about, environmental history is so much more, right? It's and for me, it means water. I mean, like, from my research, it always connects with water, and I think that's what's come through a lot here as well. We're talking about connections across the North Sea, across the Baltic, going down rivers, and it connects very much also with what you've pioneered, David, with your coastal history, for example. And I think these are these big themes, I guess, which connect us, like in lots of different ways. Talking about the Lifty project, for example. The sea is obviously it's vital, for these connections between the Northern Isles and Germany, or the whole of Roman Empire. And I think, I'm increasingly convinced that we have to look at these waterways even more when we've already done, and that we have to take these transnational approaches much more. And we're talking about northern narratives here. We're not talking about Scottish narratives or Scandinavian narratives. We're looking at northern narratives, and what connects all of that are the seas, and by extension the rivers as well. And that's environmental history for me as well, because we're looking at these landscapes or seascapes, in this case, which connects people on so many different levels, and that's really important to our work.
Yeah, and these are transnational spaces, contested spaces.
Yeah.
There's a legal element to that, and I'm just seeing comments coming up in the chat around this migration, assimilation, and so on. Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, I can't keep up with the chat here. Apologies, I'm not going to be able to read all of these out, but that's really interesting. Yeah, I was lucky to supervise a PhD funded PhD, European funds, on salmon and the Atlantic salmon in the north of Scotland, and that to me was the human-animal relations element here it's really important, and there's a lot that can be done there. I still think that that's another gap that maybe complements what you're talking about, Catherine. Certainly different fish, salmon, herring. We know quite a lot about herring, I suppose. But I think that can be a really useful approach, and one that the early modern can excel or can provide really compelling detail for. So do we just go into the chat again? Religious landscapes. Okay, yeah. Excellent, really good comments. Well worth a read. So a couple of other areas I want to just talk about, and I think I want to come back to teaching. But before we get on to teaching, one of the things I wondered if it had been talked about at the conference, and it's so important, is language. You've talked so much today about how interconnected these northern communities were, from the Atlantic through the North Sea into the Baltic. And obviously that was a Latin world to some extent, and for some of this period. But how were people communicating? How were these connections being formed? Steve Murdoch, who can't speak here, was pointing to some really interesting evidence from the Marine Lives database, which posited, there's a source in there that talks about a North Sea language. So we're a long way from studying that in a sense. The Mediterranean has been such a strong focus in terms of European history regarding what Eric Dursterler would call the multilingual mosaic goes back to Brodel, doesn't it, as well? What about North Sea languages or a North Sea language? To what extent was German our lingua franca when we get after the Reformation and beyond in terms of communication in these spaces? I wondered if you had any comments on that, and I'm going to ask Lucy first because I've left her till last until now. So I'm going to ask Lucy first on language and its role in all of this.
Thanks, David. I'm going to come at this slightly left field, I suppose, but not really thinking about what everybody's highlights were, because I've been struck through a lot of the sessions and papers that I've been able to attend by the frequent and marked evidence of communications that transcend verbal and written language in the period, and in communicating our research beyond academia. So right from the outset with Professor Gardiner's keynote through the panel discussion we closed with yesterday, the importance of material culture, whether it's buildings, clothing, carved stones, pottery, the food that can be purchased and consumed, the ships that could be mustered by kings, the beautiful maps that have been a recurring feature in so many of the papers. These means of communication between cultures and in influencing and shaping and informing social groups in different regions seem to be really important as a form of communication in this era. So, well, I think we need to know more about how people communicated and the extent to which early modern Europeans might have been multilingual in a way that perhaps we couldn't even contend at the moment. I also think that it's vital to remember that one of the critical forms through which they communicated was through and with material things. And I thought that Anna Groundwater's point about in her paper, she used the phrase object as a visual vocabulary, and this is not something just for communicating with the modern public about the early modern past, but for me it's also a key medium through which early modern people were communicating, and I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, and both in the religious sphere and the secular sphere, and perhaps overlaps between those two. Yeah, terrific. Anybody else want to come in on that point around languages or communication, vocabulary?
Perhaps I could add a few comments. I mean, I think that it's quite helpful if one thinks about one's own modern experience, that, you know, we go to countries and we don't necessarily speak the language. I remember 10 years ago, we went to Georgia in the Caucasus rather than Georgia in America. And, you know, you've got a different script, you've got a totally different language, which is unrelated to, you know, Western European languages. And yet somehow we managed perfectly well to get round. And, you know, my daughter was with me, she spoke a bit of Russian, and that got us so far, and so on. And somehow, you know, as Lucy said, communication is possible. It's possible by gesture, by expression, by body language, as well as by objects. So I think that, you know, we can overemphasize the use of spoken language, and, you know, people want to communicate, they want to understand, they want to be able to talk, but they can do it in all sorts of ways. So it's not only about the use of words, I think, although of course words are very important.
So Catherine's using a form of communication by putting her hand up here. So yes. Over to you, Catherine.
There you go. Yeah, I agree with that. And these are really important points. And yet language is still really important when you stay somewhere for longer. So the evidence I see of people who are migrating to places, they blend in after a very short time, actually, in some cases, and they do learn the lingua franca. So if you look at Scottish soldiers or officers in the Swedish Army uses German, they learn the language, they communicate in German. And I can't, when I'm reading their letters, I can't see a difference in terms of, you know, obviously they will have secretaries and so on, but you can really tell these people understood German fluently, and they were able to express themselves in German fluently after a relatively short time period, and other languages as well in some cases. Some of them were university educated and had Latin, for example, and so it always amazes me a little bit, you know, when I think about that, because they're very quick at picking up a foreign language. and utilizing that to their advantage. And they had to, making a living in these Baltic communities, for example, and within the Swedish Army.
Yeah, and I think in that military sphere, it's clearly, while I take the point absolutely about non-verbal forms of communication, it was a huge source of concern, wasn't it, to ensure that the soldiers were able to communicate. And I'm thinking of, I don't know what the latest research is on Die Fruchtbringende Gesellschaft, Katrin, but those bodies that were attempting to promote German as a language of communication across the military. Piccolomini was involved in that, I think, but that's another story. Yeah, thanks for that. Simon, any comments? I think you've given us quite a lot already on this, but maybe you have a response to some of these.
Well, following on from Lucy, it's more related to my personal interest, but it occurs to me that heraldry also was a universal language across a lot of, across most of, Polish heraldry was different and Scottish heraldry was developing in its own way, but there were heralds who were going back and forwards, common languages of blazon, and also, obviously it belonged to the elite, but everyone would be interacting with it in one way or another. The coat of arms on was it Scallowa Castle, and also on the grain storage building, everyone would be interacting with heraldry. It was a visual language that people would be especially familiar with. And Walter Scott in Rob Roy, every gentleman had to learn heraldry and know all the coats of arms of families, and it would have been a European language as well. So that's just one thought that occurs to me. And ritual, of course, the coronation ritual and all the social rituals, which could be very similar, but might be subtly different. And if you did something slightly wrong or different, it could have a big impact.
Yeah, and it's a sensory world as well. It's a history of the senses is obviously allows us other approaches into this too, in terms of forms of communication through smell or whatever it might be. Wonderful. Okay, so after this session, which we've got a few more minutes, we're going to be talking, I think the focus is the MLitt, Early Modern European Studies, and its teaching. And as we all know, the connection between research and teaching is quite a complex one. We often hear about research informed teaching, but teaching can also inform our research. And I wanted to ask all our speakers, again, to just maybe bring an example of how your research for this conference might inform your teaching, or how your teaching has informed it already. So interactions between what you spoke about at this conference and what you teach day in, day out. So I'm going to ask Katrin first that question.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think research is absolutely vital for teaching. It is an absolute pleasure every time I have a research-led module to talk to students and to hear their views on documents and maybe get very different opinions on documents which I had not really thought about. So this is definitely a two-way street, as you said. So we facilitate teaching through a research, but we always get something back as well, I think, from our student bodies, and I think that is really important. Yeah, I just feel like that there are so many diverse approaches to capture students' imaginations. If you're enthusiastic about what you're teaching, and I think we are all very enthusiastic about our research, so I think that is one of the most important things to bear in mind here, that what we are doing in our sometimes very isolated world, when we go into the archives, for example, and speak or just look at our documents, there is a wider audience to benefit from what we are doing, and I think it is absolutely beneficial for us to get these inputs, from the student communities, to further our research and go back to the archives with other questions and ideas. So yeah, I think these two-way streets are really important to bear in mind, and they're definitely in existence.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's a third element here, bringing on board the focus on public history, which is not students and not researchers, but the people we meet out in the world and how they engage with our work and how they can inform it. Lucy, over to you for some thoughts on this.
Thanks, David. Well, as my paper was largely about this topic, I won't bore everybody with saying it all again. But basically, I think the two-way flow between research and teaching through my work on public history and the Perth Charterhouse project, as I was trying to demonstrate yesterday, is that while research-led teaching, i.e. sharing those things that we and our colleagues have recently or in the midst of researching is hugely valuable for the students. As Katrin was saying, I think what we get back is equally important. And I think that also in an environment where we are challenged to balance increasingly heavy workloads and in which research can feel squeezed, it's also essential for us to remember that our teaching offers us these important means of furthering elements of our methodological, theoretical or research developments through our activities in supporting our students. And I think it's a really symbiotic relationship that we should celebrate, but also that we should write and talk about more and share with others the role that this can play in our endeavours, particularly the students. Telling the students more about how valuable what we do with them is to the way that we research, I think is really important. And I think also something that I've been thinking about more when we were talking about how we do what we do and how that's important to communicate it to the public. Obviously, we're always thinking about our skills and how we can share our skills with our students. But I think one thing that I've thought about more through the course of this conference and the conversations we've been having is, how there are other ways that I can do that? Are there other ways that I can help them understand the languages, the documents that we deal with, the practice of what we do as historians? So yeah, I think that for me is the key thing to take away.
Nicely put, Lucy. Yeah, really good points. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Simon and then Mark. But Simon, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, the paper that Mark and I gave, the paper we gave, does closely relate to some of my teaching. I teach a course on theology and the Long Reformation, which goes from the kind of late 14th century through to the 16th century, and actually could go to 17th century, but we don't have time for that. So yeah, it definitely has already informed it. I think I might answer the question backwards, which is how could the conference impact my kind of teaching or research-led teaching. And I think the focus on the northern narratives, also the Atlantic world, which I've become aware of more and more and been working with New England and this, but also the connections of Netherlands and Sweden and things. And I'm about to teach with some colleagues an entirely new course for me on archives from New College, mainly from New College, and students will be able to do a project on a particular book or manuscript. So I think some of these things about the connections between the northern narratives and the way books and ideas were circulating, and the Reformation was also circulating in the Britain and Ireland and the northern world, I think that will impact me and thinking about some of the material questions that we've raised as well.
Yeah, it's a lovely way of putting it in terms of that circulation. Excellent. So, Mark.
Well, can I pick up a point that that Andrew's just put in the chat, that he said that he brings up the point that the best way to get a deeper understanding of our own research is actually to teach it, and that's absolutely true. I mean, I have written papers that have come directly out of the fact I've had to teach the subject, and I've realised I didn't really understand it. And I thought, well, not only do I not understand it, I don't think anyone's really bottomed this problem out. And so that I think there is, we often pay lip service to the synergy between teaching and research, but I do believe there is a genuine synergy there. But I wanted to pick up, not to answer your question sort of slightly obliquely, and go back to a particular incident which has stayed with me, although it must have been 15 years ago, I suppose. And we were taking the students, this was when I was in Belfast, we were taking the students to Carlingford on a field trip. And I had been to Carlingford before, but I didn't know the town. And I remember two of my colleagues were talking about particular buildings in Carlingford, and one of them disagreed with the other. and the person who had been disagreed with, if we can think about it like that, sort of came back and said, you shouldn't have done that in front, afterwards, shouldn't have done that in front of the students. Well, actually, I would say that's exactly what you should do in front of the students. It's the dialogue, which is so exciting for them to see two people disagreeing, to see them, how they work out the different sorts of evidence, how they see the process taking place, I think is sort of fundamental. And I think we often have to sort of have the confidence to sort of embrace this, if you like, disorganized teaching, that we're prepared to not hand them, gobbits of knowledge, which are all worked out, it's all sorted out, but actually say, well, this is what I'm thinking, but hang on, there might be that, and there might be that. And if there's a sort of dialogue of disagreement, and constructively, I think that it can be terrifically constructive.
Well said. Well said. That's an excellent point, and a really good point. I think we need to finish up soon. I'm sorry about that. I haven't really had a chance to bring in the audience, but yeah, excellent points. Can I just ask, hopefully we can copy the chat here, because there's some fantastic comments in the chat, which I hope won't be lost. So I don't know if I could just make that plea to the organisers, if we could copy some of that and somehow make that accessible, that would be excellent. But I think we're going to have to finish off here, and I'm really sorry again to the audience. We didn't have a chance to actually bring you in to ask questions, but we had a good discussion, I think. And I think we moved from disagreement as being a fundamental part of what we're doing, but maybe disagreement is the route to re-enchantment. And in terms of the early modern, this MLitt might just help you do that. So if that isn't a really crude way of finishing off, I hope clearly it is. But I'm going to leave it at that anyway. But thanks to all our speakers. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to take part in more of the conference. Clearly I was uninformed about aspects, but clearly it has also been a very inspiring event. So thanks to all of you for coming along. And I'm going to pass over. I think there's a break now, but do we reconvene at 11:15? Is that right? Or Andrew or Captain want to come in now?
That's correct. So it was actually quite a nice break.